Welcome to Xochitl. This is a podcast about poetic thinking where we share with you a different perspective of the social world. Every episode, we take a topic or a concept and we use the lens of philosophy, psychology, mythology, and literature to analyze the wonderful horrors of the modern world. My name is Andrea Martinez.
My name is Andrea Celeste, and today we are going to talk about health and disease and how seemingly unrelated fields such as poetry and the economy can be understood in these terms. Health and disease have been the crucial themes of 2020, Year of the Rat. And so we will explore their meaning across four different areas, the physical, the psychological, the social, and the spiritual. Of course, we will inevitably talk about the pandemic, but rather than focusing on statistics and medicine, we will look at how these areas affect one another and come to build diseased and/or healthy societies.
So we're just going to start with basic definitions of what is meant by health and disease from the World Health Organization. I'm just going to talk a very little bit about the debate surrounding these definitions. So originally, we understood health as the absence of disease, but now, according to the World Health Organization, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely absence of disease and infirmity. So even, of course, the World Health Organization recognizes health as an encompassing different aspects of human life, which are not only restricted to the physical aspect, but also psychological and social well-being.
So in this sense, what you're saying is that I can have a physical disease but be healthy in many, or something. Yes, like I can have cancer but be healthy.
Psychologically healthy. Well, that depends, I guess, on the model of health that you are looking at. More conservative models of health that I think are, what we are more familiar with, think that, these three pillars are separate and that you can have a healthy mind but a sick body. But then we have more recent models of health, like the biopsychosocial model, that say, okay, if one of these goes out of balance, then the other two are also affected. So it kind of depends on the perspective. Of course, there's still very orthodox kind of views on health and medicine, but there's also a large...
By orthodox, you mean Western Orthodox, I guess, right?
Yes, that's what I mean. But now within the West, of course, the West has learned a lot, how and have implemented a lot of Eastern alternative to not to maybe an extent that is sufficient, but we have tried to implement it in some aspects.
There is this thing. Well, in the Chinese tradition, is in the olden days, you would pay. The relationship with your doctor would be set in this way. You would pay him a fee constantly until you got sick, and whenever you got sick and you had a disease, then you would stop paying him.
Right.
So you would pay him so he would prevent that, and that is sort of a manner of understanding why most of what we call Chinese medicine is preventive medicine, which is if you keep certain habits and procure certain habits in your life, you will be healthy, and not so much as having this particular cure for something, this one thing that cures this one thing,
right?
That there is much more Western,
It's a more holistic approach. And also, yeah. I mean, we always have this kind of documentaries or articles in the West about, the cities with what are called blue zones, right? In terms of longevity, with the largest amount of the oldest people. And one of these places is in Japan. I forget the name of the city, or the name of the town. But one of the things that happens that scientists have discovered in this town is not only that people pay attention to their health, obviously, but how much they eat every day, like the amount they eat, what they eat, how do they socialize with others, how much the community is important, physical exercise. So this is just,
Yeah,
again, a representative of a more holistic approach to health.
yeah, of an related to an ethos, the Greeks would even say, because it's this. I've mentioned this before, and I will mention this off again, which is the the approach of what is ethical is the well-being of the thing.
Mhm.
So one must do whatever is so an ethical way of action is to procure your health. One can stretch that for various ways that conceptually, but it's interesting that you can narrow it down to this habits and this just step by step thing, not one uh, grand gesture of of either of disease or of life. I don't know if
Right.
I made myself clear.
Yeah, I think the best example that we have at the moment is, and we'll keep coming back to this today in this episode, is the pandemic, right? Like all of a sudden, the best news that we've had is that two companies have come up with a vaccine that has 95% rate success. And all of a sudden, everybody is like betting on this one cure, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there are like
And
issues.
the Chinese are secretly saying, no, guys, just just follow these rules, these very specific rules forever.
Well, actually, the Asian countries have been remarkably and also kind of in a scary way successful. It's scary for the rest of us, who keep having like thousands, or
The
in the
rest of us
States
who believe
hundreds
in
of thousands of cases a
freedom.
day. Yeah, yeah. In comparison to how they've handled the pandemic in Asia, where like in some countries it's gone down to zero, right? And some of the reasons that are of course very entrenched culturally and historically, but first of all, is that they've been able to guarantee healthcare for everybody. So even though,
Ethically, they're winning as well.
yeah, so like you said, the Chinese example of like paying the doctor before you get sick, Taiwan and other China as well have made sure that everybody has, like, they've changed their system in a way that everybody now has healthcare. Something that, of course, the Americans refuse to do, because why would you? Um, But it's not only been that, there's been legal changes as well in, for example, Taiwan, who has been one of the most successful countries dealing with the pandemic. And also, they made, in Taiwan specifically, they made government officials equally powerful as healthcare officials, which is something that has not really happened in the West, where the government still gets the final decision, and because the government wants to keep the economy afloat, sometimes the health, the healthcare of the population, because everybody just does
They can choose not to listen to the science. That's
right.
been one of the many the constant phrases we've heard this year of the rat.
Yes, and Dr. Fauci, people
Yeah,
listening to.
and Dr. Fauci saying stuff like, yeah, he gets briefed every day or every other day of the things that we're doing in
Right.
this pandemic.
Um,
So
and so I think that one of the big lessons that, I mean, of course, there's been also the liberal side of the state being, of course, extremely critical of China in terms of how they censored at the beginning when the virus started spreading in China. One of the main weapons against them is that, oh, they tried to cover it up. And because they tried to cover it up, it's like the absolutist government of China censoring free speech,
yeah,
right?
again, and what we don't see, and we're not being apologetic to all the things that are wrong with the Chinese government, but What we don't see is, yeah, but their tracking records were fantastic. I mean, the control, the way they control the crisis control, is actually the way to say it, was, I mean, again, it's almost down to zero. Now, we said we weren't to talk about so much statistics, and we sort of have, but um, jumping back to this also um, Chinese tradition of working towards the prevention of disease more than the curing of a disease, just preventing disease by staying healthy, or whatever it is that was that is understood by health, that it has to do with in this one world vision view, just to be in balance and in harmony with the inside and the outside, and the levels of temperature, and all this whole thing, from everything, like, and the naturistic and more holistic medicines that are
Approach, yeah.
still, yeah, approach, have this thing, like, if what we need to cure is the fever, that this is one concept, because pathos, which is, again, we've been talking about pathos in every episode, and I think we're gonna keep talking about pathos, because pathos, which is the disease, means this um, inflammation, just this being inflamed by this this inflammation, and well, now moving a little bit more to the West, but also in the world,
Before
or
you move to the West,
yeah.
can I just say something more? There's one more thing about this um, gap that has been so clearly opened between the handling of the pandemic in the West versus in Asian countries. You mentioned data tracking, right? That has been yet another criticism against them. They're like, oh, they own all their data, and like our privacy, like don't touch our privacy.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like little believies, like Louis C.K. would say.
right.
I have privacy as a little believy.
Louis C.K., who has become such a persona non grata, but who is still saying brilliant things wherever he can. But yeah, so one of the things that like is South Korea and other Asian countries have done so well is to be able to track to do contact tracing so quickly, and also apparently mask availability tracing. So I don't know what's it been like in Mexico, but in Ireland, it's extremely difficult to get a hold of the N85 or N95 masks, or
Oh yeah,
the best ones, right? Like nobody, we don't know where they exist. I sometimes see people wearing them, but like nobody knows. Like I don't know where to buy them. Every time I look for them, they're out of stock. But in South Korea, apparently they have an app that like it just tells you where there's
where they
availability,
have it.
where they have them. And this kind of technological, not only capacity, but also the efficiency of it, like, it really kind of counteracts the claim of please don't steal my data, like in a
Yeah,
way.
it's in the end is that it's a tantrum. I look at it sort of as a kind of tantrum. The other day I was saying, like, one of the reasons I don't want to have TikTok is because I don't want the Chinese to have my data. And everyone looked at me and said, like, yeah, but
Google has your
yeah,
data.
everyone has your data already. I mean, the Chinese already have my data. I mean, they don't need TikTok. They can buy from Google. And
Exactly.
they must, yeah, whatever. So, but it's this little bubble we make, and that bubble, it's
Of this is mine. You
no,
cannot
but
cross the boundary of what is mine and my property because it
and that
belongs to
that
me.
illusion also is an illusion of health, to be able to do that, and like, no, like, I have my privacy and that's it, because otherwise the world ends. I mean, fine, if that's all you need to be okay with the world, then that's the way you don't die, and you're able to cope, but you're not really coping with reality. You're just living through your beliefs,
And yeah, and I
and
think,
that's
sorry,
another. Oh yeah.
that coping with reality, I think it's been exactly the paradox of the pandemic, right? Where like you're like, okay, if this is the way that you cope with reality, like with this tantrum and this kind of self-isolating bubble, the pandemic has in a way brilliantly burst that bubble in a way that we can see in the numbers of cases how the consequences of our actions, and how everything is connected in this more holistic, more like there are systems who are and areas of life that are connected all to each other, and that before you thought, and people, of course, they like the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers still think that nothing is connected, and like they can go to the pub and whatever and do whatever and it's still fine. But like the pandemic has truly revealed the level of interconnectivity in our world, and how isolated we are not.
My dad was an anti-vaxxer. I didn't get my shots.
Shout out to Mr.
Yeah.
Padilla.
Oh yeah, hey dad. So but he's gonna get this one. Like he's been talking how he's so getting this one. He's getting vaccinated for this one, which in a way I'm glad this pandemic changed his mind. And I secretly, actually, when I was in primary school, I would forge my parents' signature, so I would be in the campaign in the vaccine campaign.
Right.
I was like, I don't want to be a weirdo that that their parents don't. I wanted to be just, so I would forge their signature. Like, yeah, give it here.
But it's the same as we were saying before, right? It's like, okay, this vaccine is going to cure it all, and this is the solution to everything. Where you're like, no, there's a lot of things.
No. Yeah, and returning to my moving to the West.
Yeah.
To this last, or well, not last, but in some people say it like this. But this ambivalent mask the Greek have between being the cradle of the West, of Western thought, as well as having a lot of influence from Asian thought in the Middle East, from the Middle East and the Persian thought to the farther east. So Hippocrates, which is the proverbial doctor, the archetype, the archetypal doctor, says, and I quote him, I quote the doctor: everyone has a physician inside him or her. We just have to help it in its work. The natural healing force within each one of us is the greatest force in getting well. Our food should be our medicine. Our medicine should be our food. But to eat when you are sick is to feed your sickness. And I remember I can connect this with a saying in Spanish that says, in Spanish, it's de limpios y tragones están llenos los panteones.
All right, so I'll just translate that to English very quickly. Of those who are cleaned and those who eat well, those
no. Tragones is and gluttons. They're gluttons.
Okay, so of the super clean ones and the gluttons, the cemeteries are filled with.
Yeah.
So
this means that I remember growing up. I was raised by a pair of anti-vaxxers, naturalistic approach. I hated getting sick because the thing that was punished was food. Well, not punished. And look, how traumatized I am. Not punished, but I mean, the thing that was like, yeah, but if you're sick, if you have a fever, you can't eat chocolate because you will only raise that fever, because it's all related with this whole Hippocrates thing. And I remember saying, like, what do you mean? Like, you choose one fruit. You choose a fruit and you sleep a lot and you live it out.
and this has been one of the main points of not disagreement, but maybe of difference between Andrea and I, because I was raised by my mother is a medical doctor, of like an old school medical doctor, that everything is, you focus on the disease and you medicate the shit out of it.
Even if it has to kill you.
Yeah, and like, I mean, it's really those forms of thoughts that both naturist kind of, like Andrea's parents and my own, they find no way to reconcile both extremes, whereas I think they are actually, they should
Both,
work together.
yeah, they should.
Both are useful. You should get the vaccine when it comes out, but also you should
Eat
not believe in
well.
your
Yeah,
freedom
you
so
should
much.
medicine should be your food. In that sense, I think we do need to recognize that that is the tendency. The tendency is to link these two things together.
And just to
You
talk about this difference that we talked about in terms of our parents, of my mother, who is like extremely, a quote unquote science driven, like in the Western sense of science, and like um, in this mindset, whereas Andrea's parents are more holistic. Max Weber talked about periods in history,
Yeah.
and we'll relate this back to the pathology of society, right? Which also has been, discussed widely by, and not just in terms of health, like Foucault will talk about in terms of medicine, but also in terms of what is the sickness of society. But Max Weber says that we enter cycles of enchantment, re-enchantment, and disenchantment, and those of
Mhm.
that are the cycles of disenchantment are those characterized by secularization, systematic, bureaucratic modes.
Or theocratization. I mean,
Wait, and so the re-enchantment ones are more towards
theocratic thought.
theocratic, more religious, more sometimes mystical, sometimes kind of like crazy cultish.
Yeah,
um
it's the same thing in history of art. You have uh this same continuum that goes up and down, and the down, well, or the up, whatever, you can change them. Well, the disenchantment, the enchantment ones are the ones that tend to be religious, any kind of just religious
right,
driven. And the other extreme is more scientific driven. And there, I mean, poetic thinking, as we have said in the last episodes, can link both of them,
both,
but it's
because
always
each side
very,
has its own malady, right?
yeah,
And so more
its
recent
own radicalness.
is, yeah, and its own downside. And one of the things that more recent Bavarian academics say is that we have entered an era where we have both, and you can see very clearly this in 2020, enchantment with, like, kind of it, the belief in the cult of one person, and the anti-vaxxer movement, the hyper religiosity in the states in some areas, and also the hyper secularization of different parts of the world, more like really pushing science because it's a response to the other side. And so it seems that now these two sides, uh, again, something that we've already mentioned in previous episodes, because they've become so polarized and are just responding to one another, are actually exacerbating each other's pathologies in a way that
Yeah,
there is
and
no
that's what's
bridge.
happening now, because that's this whole the tribalism we see, or the manichaeism we see in all dimensions of, or various dimensions of our society, means this: as far left you go, others go farther right. That's just it's the tug of war. It's this. And in this sense, before we leave one of my favorite places, ancient Greece, um, I would like to talk a little bit about the pre-Socratics, which are two things at once. Um, the first scientists and the first poets. As we come from the same root in both here and in China.
Here, there,
That's
and
a
everywhere.
here, there, and everywhere. That's a saying in Spanish. We always say here and in China, to say like
Right.
this
Yes.
happens
Because
everywhere.
China, to us
Yeah,
in our culture, is like the furthest
yeah, the
place.
furthest. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's here in China, whatever. So So, and here and in China, the wise ones, I'm thinking of the Tlamaltini as well, always remembering in Xochitl, the pre-Socratics. They belong to a chapter of Paideia. This is a book. This is a book that if you're interested in Greek thought, you should visit. It's a book by Werner Jager, who's a 20th century philosopher, studious of the Greeks, expert in the Greeks. And he has this book that goes from poets to politicians, the huge spectrum of Greek thought. And in one of these chapters, he speaks of one of the big deals that the Greek thought did was the revealing of the cosmos. And the revealing of the cosmos has a direct relationship with logos, which is the word. So these first poets, we must think of them as they are wise because they know how to articulate a discourse. And part of this discourse, which is very poetically woven, are basically precepts to how to live your life. So the wise ones are the ones that tell you stuff like, you know, people that think rationally, as Heraclitus say, they don't wash their hands with mud, they wash their hands with water. And there some of them are very cryptic, like, and some of them are more open and relatable, but they all have to do with the mystery of how to initiate yourself in a good life, and for the Greeks, a good life is a life of harmony, a harmonious life, that also means healthy, and that also means ethical. So and well, that regardless of that regarding well, the ancients in that
And
part of the
in
world.
that sense that you talk about harmony, I think that that's been one of the, also just going back to this comparison between the East and the West. So there's been a little bit, not a lot, but I'm sure there will be a lot more analysis of the Asian success with the pandemic. And of course, one of the people that has been interviewed that has been well praised in academia, although I do have a few things that I'm going to disagree with him on,
Oh, I know who.
is Byung-Chul Han. Byung-Chul Han had
Who is he?
who is he? He is a philosopher from South Korea that has been residing in Berlin for years. And so he was interviewed recently by El País, by the newspaper El País, asking him about the Asian success. And he said something that it was very similar to what Trump said. Funnily enough, he said in the interview, the virus must not undermine our freedom. And who said it
Oh,
best?
right, he did.
Uh,
No, but but he means
wait,
in a more, okay, yeah, wait,
Trump said, don't let the virus control your
yeah, control
life.
you. Yeah.
Control your life, right? And Byung-Chul Han, of course, there are things, there's affirmations that he makes always that, like, everybody's like, oh yeah, of course. Um, and he says that Asian communities have been more able to follow hygiene guidelines and safety regulations and all of these. And well, then he jumps and says that because they have done this, they have more freedom. But I think in that sense, Byung-Chul Han has very well adapted his um, or not adapted, but like he's very well put forward the Western emphasis on freedom in order to get his point across. Um, I think that more importantly is this idea that you mentioned about the Greeks, but also in relation to Asia, that the importance there is the emphasis is not placed on the individual or on freedom or on free speech or any of these values, but the emphasis is placed on harmony and the community. And so therefore, and also just one more point, the Japanese prime minister was strongly criticized in the media because he said that the Japanese had actually excelled at handling the pandemic because basically they have better manners, right? They have like better like social education.
Yeah, Japanese manners, like they have Japanese manners.
And basically what that meant was that in the like, this is of course generalizing in a way that it can be a bit simplistic, but that you're taking care of yourself involves taking care of the community, and if you're not taking
Yeah,
care of the community, then
you're
you're
not
not
taking care of
maintaining
yours.
the order and you're not maintaining harmony, and so
Yeah, and
therefore.
you're not you're not life worthy, actually. I mean, in the most radical sense of that view, because um they will extirp out the tumor, whatever it takes.
And the thing that has been shocking to me to a certain extent is that when we had to start wearing masks, I don't know what happened in Mexico because I haven't been there for the pandemic, but when we had to start wearing masks only indoors in Ireland, because we don't have to wear masks in public because Ireland is not heavily populated, so you don't actually, you're rarely standing in a crowd unless you're in the queue for the pub, because people
Yeah.
still find a way to go to the pub because it's Ireland. Is that people started very quickly to complain that they couldn't breathe with the masks, and they found them very uncomfortable. And there were a lot of like that I heard from people that I interact with, that they were like, oh, I can't breathe. And I'm like, well, the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the South Koreans have been wearing them for months outside,
Working
like,
and
and they're
inside.
fine. So why won't you be all right? And
Yeah.
so this kind of like difference in behavior and in attitudes towards compliance, which of course has also its downsides, and we can see that like in very obvious ways in and what China is already criticized for, and I'm not going to repeat it here, but one of the advantages that they've had is that because people are compliant and they are worried about the welfare of their community, they actually obey, and they're not finding ways of throwing illegal raves in the countryside like they do here, for example.
Yeah, or here. Well, actually, I think this reaction, and this more Western reaction that holds freedom first, or an idea of freedom, has to do with how disease, or the possibility of being diseased, is related to being untouchable, to 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 this, um, and to be, and if you're sick, you are untouchable, and you must be in some sort of confinement. And to that, Foucault, for instance, in History of Madness, which is, he talks about more there, obviously, about mental health or mental disease, um, but how, well, mental health patients have this taboo around them, of keeping them inside in a very specific place. And this has to do with the fact that, when in medieval times the Foley and the disabled and the sick were proning the streets of our, um, first modern cities, that are the medieval cities, they started to not be so welcome, in terms of being, the roaming the streets. So, in this sense, what happens is that the one of the biggest plagues that hits these times, aside from the Black Plague, is also leprosy.
Mhm.
So we have these buildings that are made for the lepers, where you put the lepers inside because you mustn't be near a leper, or they are the untouchables. And now leprosy is sort of controlled, and now we have these buildings that are empty and useless. So for these beings that we could also call this borderline beings, that are sort of in society but outside, because they're crazy, they're the crazy ones, we and they are uncomfortable to society. they are sent there. They're sent there, and that is how well that's the origins of the psychiatric hospital, and as well as the jail, as well as prisons.
Right.
That's Foucault will later on develop that, how also the criminal, because the criminals and the deceased have this taboo of being untouchables, both of them, an ancient taboo that he um, who commits the transgression of the law of taboo becomes itself uh, deceased by the taboo.
Right.
So if you kill your father, you become untouchable. You become this a symbolic disease, as well as if you are in if you do have some other sort of actual specific disease, not just the symbolic disease of having committed what we consider a crime, which means a, a disease in society. That is why in psychiatric the psychiatric canon, or corpus, um, being being a criminal is part of being in the antisocial disorder. So it remain they a linkage remains between these two in terms of this taboo.
And also the fear, I think, and I think that we haven't talked enough about fear in our episodes, but I think partly the reason to lock people in is, I'm referring more to the psychiatric asylum, is that those diseases are, or those disorders, mental disorders, that, you know, often, like if you look at the World Health Organization definitions of mental disorder and all of this, is like, you know, behavior, attitudes that harm or are dysfunctional in society and towards others, or like, you know, it's a bit more complex than that, but like those are the main, the
It's
key
not a
words.
disease. It's not a disease.
It's a disorder,
It's a
right? It's a
disorder. Yeah.
disorder. But that there are aspects to those diseases, or to the disorders, sorry, my bad, that are present in all of us, and that to witness them in front of us reminds us of elements in ourselves that are not there, are like fully blown, you know, blossomed, and they never will for most of us, and that's why we are gallivanting the streets. But the seed, like we're able to recognize, you know, the paranoia of the paranoid schizoid. We're able to recognize the, you know, the delirium of the schizophrenic, to an extent that it worries me that
I can cross that line and
I can
become
cross
that.
that line. Right.
And yeah, and in that sense, I mean, when I was studying psychology, I remember my generation crossed the change in study plan. So a lot of the subjects were renamed, and for instance, one subject was called the pathological personality in the old plan, and in the new plan, it was called uh, the personality disorders.
Mm-hmm.
So this is also a way of of you know, not marking the disorder that can be perhaps or we strive for that, to work with new experiences that are both in the realm of environment, as well as working with the psychiatric medicine in order to get through this. You won't die from this won't kill you, the disorder, but what happens is it impairs your experience in life. It is impair. Is it
Impair,
am
yeah.
I making sense?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
English sense. And that is why we don't want to look at it as a disease, but it comes from this tradition of once in our history, it came from this whole um, of this whole world where there was no difference. It's just, if you act, I mean, in the earliest psychiatric hospitals, that's what Foucault says, is like, you have everyone there. In our first attempts of building the mental hospital, what Foucault says is that in there, at the beginning, you have people with whole special needs, not necessarily people who had leprosy or had any kind of, particular disease, just anyone who was uncomfortable and who was remotely weird, queer, whatever. Just put it there, put it all inside, and then we will specialize this space, and we will divide this space, and we will have prison on one end and just the psychiatric hospital on the other. No.
And of course, I mean, in this, just to also kind of land this mental disorders categorization of, the what should go into an asylum, like the paranoid, schizoid, schizophrenic, depressive, bipolar, narcissistic, etc. All of this is mostly rooted in Western society, mainly, or if not primarily, because of the emphasis in Western in our society on autonomy and independence from very young ages. And I think this is something that psychodynamic or object relations theorists like Melanie Klein and others would have said that we try to train our children, our babies, to be independent. Like, for example, let him cry it out, or in a way that it would surprise us if kittens, or if cats did that to their kittens, or if dogs did that to their puppies. But in our minds, it's so important to get our children to develop autonomy and independence that we've kind of lost that common sense to hold and, hold the child in a way that is natural. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that what you're describing is more of the most radical way of this let him cry it out, that would stress the child, instead of just saying like we that's what could be in danger, that this search of autonomy, that we strive for the child to, in order, if he cries it out or if he deals with the crisis, he will own himself, herself. The worst experience of that is that the child finds him or herself hopeless and in this fear of the other and of him or herself.
Yes,
And
that's exactly what I was getting at.
You kind of become what would in earlier psychiatric terms would become pathological.
Right. So No, I mean, it can happen to both extremes. If you, of course, if there is an over parenting, or if there is not enough mirroring of the child, or not enough holding of the child, where the child, like you said, feels hopeless or isolated.
In that sense, like, I have this great example, I'm sorry,
Please.
In Shakespeare, and this is interesting because today is Saint Edmund, and Edmund is one of Shakespeare's greatest villains. And well, what happens? I'm talking about the tragedy of King Lear, and well, Lear deals with parenting in various levels, as other various subjects. But in one of the lines of the anecdote, there is this problem between two brothers. One brother that is a legitimate son, and the other brother who's the bastard. And in reality, the father favors more the bastard, but he can't really say that in public. He can't really give him the whole favor because he's the bastard. But the bastard knows this. The bastard's Edmund. And Edmund moves everything in his favor because the king has gone mad. And in the Shakespearean world, that means that you can do everything now because there is no head in this universe. He manipulates the situation and tells Edgar, the brother, the legitimate one, that his father hates him, and that his father fears that he thinks that Edgar has betrayed them and whatnot. And just the thought of Edgar has no idea this is happening, and the thought of Edgar acknowledging this is, he says, well, then none of my experience with my father has been real, because for me, my father loves me, and for me, he's been with me. Then if this is not true, well, then I must not be Edgar. And if I must be something else before being nothing. So I rather become Tom of Bedlam, because that is better than being nothing. And who is or what is Tom of Bedlam? Tom of Bedlam is an archetypical image of a lunatic in medieval society. Right. Bedlam was one of these first asylums. So they will sometimes go outside the asylum, and you would find, these toms of Bedlam. So what's interesting here in linking with the object relations and with the need of becoming someone is that if one doesn't have a good mirror, which is what Edgar sort of is saying here, like, well, then if what I think cannot be mirrored in reality, and my experience cannot be sustained by reality, then I am not what I think I am. And before becoming nothing, because from nothing comes nothing, before becoming nothing, I'd rather be insane. Right. I'd rather become a Tom of Bedlam. And then, well, this, just to close this idea of autonomy as well, the dramatic arc of this character is very interesting, because the resolution of the tragedy is linked to him becoming a subject and owning himself again, and being able to own his name regardless of his father. Well, he comes to terms with his father, which is what one must do, even if your parent is alive or dead. If you go to therapy, that's what that therapist would tell you. You have to come to terms with this.
And that's kind of like the path of for both psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy, where you are, kind of going back to those places that hurt from very early on, and extrapolating from this psychodynamic, psychoanalytic relation between the individual and the parents. I think if you have a society of individuals that their upbringing was in a similar way, also you create a similar relationship between government and society, where you have, and there's plenty of examples, I'm sure we can think of, the relationship between government as a parental or authority figure, because that's where our parents serve as primary types of authorities. That you establish a dysfunctional or a pathological relationship with government in the same way that we can establish a pathological or dysfunctional or both relationship with our parents. And so that's we see
what
no go
sorry that's why Kanye West wanted to be president. In a way, there's a lot of things regarding this, and Kanye West, we could talk about this disease thing, but because he thinks he has this conviction inside of him that whatever he says and thinks is right. And in the West, we have also this, and Foucault also talks about this in History of Madness, where what he says is that reason, or that can sort of translate with being right. If you're being reasonable, is that you're walking in the path of also kind of righteousness, because there is a linkage in our Western thought. Talk about various things about Kanye West, but the thing is that what he thinks is that he all of the things that he believes in are right, and that he has the right way for the Black people to understand how to empower themselves, and he has the way of, and he could provide a figure of authority for everybody. These are the things that he believes in. And the reason why he was looking to be president is because if he managed to become president, then he would manage to prove himself right and healthy, cured, because his past albums have surrounded themselves with the themes of mental health, and himself being diagnosed first. He says, then he said it was wrong, but with bipolar disorder, and how bipolar disorder had everything to do with his very passionate way of life, way of looking at life, which I wouldn't disagree. I mean, there's a lot of the problem of Western passion has everything to do with manichaeism,
Right.
with you either choose day or you choose night, and that the life of Pablo CD album has everything to do with this. I choose getting married, or I choose the booty, getting married or the booty, getting married or the booty. And if America votes for me, then this means that I am righteous and that I am okay, and that everything is that I am fine
So I'm
because
going
I
to,
am.
sorry, go on.
Yeah.
I
No, no,
I have a take on Kanye West that I've only developed this morning.
okay.
So first of all, I'm going to shout out to Professor Harry Hunt, who wrote the book Lives in Spirits. And he talks about, not about Kanye West, but about, I'm just going to try to very quickly summarize this, then to try to explain Kanye West. He says that people who he calls, or not who he calls, but like also Max Weber talked about inner worldly mysticism, which means basically that you are like in a kind of like self-actualization, peak experience, you know, in touch with the whole of life, and that you are at the height of your creativity. And so in this book, in Lives and Spirits, he talks about different figures historically. Heidegger, of course, one of them. Um, Jerry Garcia, another one of them. Aleister Crowley, people who were intellectually, creatively, what we could call secularly enlightened in terms of how creative and how brilliant they were. Like you said, there are like what Kanye West went through. Like there's two paths that are become exacerbated by this early psychodynamic stages that we all go through, and especially if in those stages there is trauma, that trauma is going to become not only more salient but potentially destructive at the height of their creativity, where you're either going to go completely narcissistic, which I think is the path that Kanye West fell into, or what it's called broken humility, where you go into the voidless, the void and the formless space of the kind of like the dark night of the soul, what is referred to as the dark night of the soul, that in Harry Hunt's book, he says Jerry Garcia did. Right, so Jerry Garcia just kind of went into
And
like
Saint Augustine.
into this kind well, for Jerry Garcia it was heroin, and he just kind of like killed himself slowly, whereas I think with Kanye West, you know, he did reach a creative peak, and then it just kind of like
Yeah, and I would like to.
he wasn't
Yeah.
held enough.
Yeah, and actually I would like to also link this, what you said, like this, the whole object relations and the trauma, and how this can obstruct your creativeness or your creative imagination, and that, let that be your downfall. I could also link that to Oedipus King, and Oedipus King is very important because the play starts with the chorus saying, you know, there is a plague in Thebes. And a plague means that a king is doing something terribly wrong. And, you know, this plague it doesn't kid around. I mean, you have black liquid coming out of instead of milk from the cows, and women giving birth to dead children, and all this, people dying in the street. And the thing is that I would like to link Oedipus to this sort of narcissistic path as well, because, and what he what he strives for is being right in a way. He comes from having murdered his father. He doesn't know this, but he comes from having murdered a person in the road, and he enters the kingdom of the king he has murdered, and he says nothing about this. Not and in the story, he doesn't know that he murdered the king of these peoples, but he doesn't say, you know what, you can make me king, even though I resolved the enigma of the Sphinx. You can't make me king because I'm a murderer. Actually, can you take me to trial? I mean, that's what a reasonable person would have said. But no, he becomes king, and allegedly, he has this great popularity, and that's the reason why the play doesn't explain itself, the order doesn't explain itself, that having such a good king as Oedipus, they have a plague. And the reason why is because he has kept silent this terrible thing he did, and has just manipulated the world to be on top, and just to actually, I would like to give a shout out to our former companion of high school, David Gaitan. He has a version of Oedipus King, who's a very good version of it. It's called Oedipus, No One is an Atheist. That's the name of the play. Because what it wants to, the problem of Oedipus is that he doesn't want to believe that there is something bigger than him that can be a plague, that's just, there's some things that you can't control with your will.
And that's fun. That's a funny parallel to today.
Yeah,
actually. So there with now is that we are kind of Oedipus.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because
Oedipus.
we think that it's like the triumph of the will, right? We have this under control, and I feel like now we are so like self congratulatory about like having two companies who came up with this vaccine, and now everything's going to be okay, and now where things are back under control, when they're like, that's just an illusion, a pathological illusion, in fact. A pathological illusion, because there is no one cure. It shouldn't be this atomistic microscope, this is the problem, but it should be a more structural reflection, which we obviously didn't do, and we're not going to do.
That's the thing. That's what the Greeks are betting at, where when for them in their symbolic order, that's what plague means. What plague means is a structural problem that goes from king to the most untouchable and least favorable member of society, and we are all involved in this. And it's not just one thing. There's this very, and just returning to Oedipus, in where there's a moment where the oracle tells them, okay, fine, I'll tell you how you get rid of the plague. You get rid of the plague when you find he who killed the last king, which is Oedipus. And says, because, and the criminal is Theban. The criminal is one from Thebes. And Oedipus, who was born in Thebes but doesn't know he comes from there, because he's the king that his parents fear of him. So they take him out of the reign. They try to kill him, but the killer doesn't kill him. So he gets raised by other parents, and then mysteriously ends up reigning his town, but not knowing he's Theban. So when the oracle says, okay, the criminal is a Theban, he says, oh, well, first of all, it's not me. So even though they say that the king is the responsible for the plague, well, it's not me, because you're saying that we need to find this killer, and I'm not the killer. And when in fact he is the killer. And that is the thing that we are not recognizing. Like, what are the things that we must do? How did we pass from it's only gonna be 4 weeks to whole 2020?
Whole 2020.
Yeah, or yeah,
of
well, I mean,
2020.
except
Um,
from the first 3 months.
and I mean, just to be a little bit before we start closing this episode, just to be a bit more positive regarding the pandemic, and we've talked a lot about the ways in which we are diseased or disordered or pathological. um, I do think that the pandemic has opened spaces for plenty of us to find new ways of communicating, or not new ways, but new time and space, even though virtual, to communicate. And so I always find I'm quite skeptical of this dichotomy of, you know, Charles Taylor talked about the malaise of modernity, and he, you know, had his three bullet points, and Byung-Chul Han is also very condemning of modernity, of our society and of social media and all these things. And I don't think it's either we are diseased or we are healthy. I think, like I think you would agree with me, there are pathologies, there are disorders that we ail from, and that we suffer. But that doesn't mean that we are diseased, or that, you know, that we will perish from this, either lack of data privacy or anything like this. It's not that simple. It's actually, you know, there are things that we can reflect on and learn from, but it's not a black and white diagnosis,
Yeah,
terminal
no,
diagnosis.
I mean, even though there's part of this fantasy of manichaeism where we would want it to be black and white, there's this sinister fantasy where we would want it to be black and white, but it's not. And what you're saying of how the pandemic has opened spaces of communication, I would add that this search for these spaces has to do with us wanting to hold our health, our well-being in the best of our ways in these times of confinement. How, even though we are confined, how we don't want to fall into the bad trip of being an untouchable, and what this means of not being able to go and hug your loved one and whatnot. These spaces are a way of coping with reality. And in this sense, well, one of the ways of of mental health, or what mental health can mean, is a person who has a cope of on reality. if if your feet are on the ground and coping with what you're dealt with, then you can be okay. You can steer your course and battle the battles you must, and whatnot. And in that sense, and in the closing argument, or closing corner of our episode, I would like to invite to the table a very polemic figure that can be that is either a genius or a nut job, in this world of black and white we live in, which is Wilhelm Reich. And well, he did. I won't go through his nut job phase, and he did a bunch of experiments with his cloud buster. He wanted to create rain and this kind of thing. And Kate Bush has this beautiful song called Cloud Busting, regarding the day the FBI came in and took everything from him, and took him to jail and interrogation. And he was a very uncomfortable figure for the first half of the 20th century, and around McCarthyism and whatnot. He was part of that witch hunt. And well, he has this very radical approach to um, the relationship between mental health and sexuality, for instance. So if psychoanalytic thought had already made this very important bridge between uh, your sexuality and how you live this sexuality, and how this affects your other parts of your life, he will be even more radical that way. But also, what he talks about in his book Analysis of Character is that and what he fears the most, and it's a very interesting thought. That's why I wanted to bring it forth. He says what he fears the most is what he calls the emotional plague. And he says, in the future, we will be plagued not by physical, biological disease, but by what the tendency of most of society will be is not being able to cope with our beliefs, and how they might not have an actual, these beliefs might not have an actual grasp on reality, and how that can be very damaging for the others. So he kind of even
Yeah, a bit prophetic.
yeah, very prophetic, but
Yeah.
he kind of,
But Wilhelm Reich, sorry, just to
yeah,
interrupt very quickly, it's also one of these figures that, was very attuned to, like, in almost in a spiritual sense, very brilliant, and then, like you said, he reached this point, and then he just kind
yeah,
of
and he went
like
went
went a
not
bit
done.
like crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
uh, well, but what he says, just to close with the idea of the emotional plague, and what he doesn't say it this way, but he kind of invites this image to our heads, where instead of, well, we'll have this kind of zombified society where you will be in danger, physical danger outside, because people with the emotional plague can come and kill you, and just hit you and kill you. And what the emotional plague is this is it's just, if you're not with me, you're against me, basically. That we've been talking about this in a
Right.
way for the last
And we will
for
continue to talk.
all our episodes. uh, and he really fears this. He says that is the worst thing, because then what you think, who you think is deceased, it's the other, and who you think you must annihilate and extirpate, or to use a more medical term, is the other. So yeah, that emotional play is a concept to think upon these
and to
times.
be cautious of.
Yes.
Do
Yeah.
not be a cautionary tale of the pathologies of the emotional pathologies of our times, basically.
And on that note, I guess what the assignment for all of us would be is to think about how we are responsible for our own plagues that we create for ourselves, and how these are related to the plague outside, the one that we're living now, but the ones to come, or whatever it is that comes to us.
Right.
And
Thank you for listening.
yeah,
We are in Xochitl. My name is Andrea Martinez,
my name is Andrea Celeste.
and we'll see you, or hopefully you'll listen to us in the next episode. Thank you.